Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. Actually, a little less than a week.
Yes, we had a
report on Thursday. First item here is scan probes on port 47808 TCP. I don't think we've talked about this one before, but obviously this activity is not entirely new. This is actually associated with a protocol called BACnet, and it gets used in automation systems, control systems, for example, HVAC automation. This is a case where you want to be, I think the target penetration was actually traced back to access through an HVAC
I've heard that.
Control system. Yeah, this is what was reported in the news. We didn't have a first-hand knowledge of that, but that was apparently the case. So this is another case where devices could potentially be connected to networks and provide a means to get through if they're not properly secured, just we were talking about with the home office routers earlier. In any case, there were actually about 3 different activities that are taking place on here, and I think the last is probably what kind of raised the attention level here. First, there are large spikes that have been going on well beyond to the left of the graph here that are basically US-based researchers that are doing scanning activity and just looking for vulnerable systems. But I would describe it as innocuous, relatively speaking. Second one, the medium spikes that have basically started around middle to the end of April and become relatively regular there. It's actually coming from a number on the order of about 142 source addresses from a provider in Switzerland. I'm inclined to believe that that's research activity as well, but I don't know the origin of that research. The previous one I kind of do. And then the third one, the lower level activity, and you can see it down in the bottom right-hand corner predominantly, and there's also some background activity taking place here that's relatively low compared to these spikes, is activity that's coming from some sources in China. So a collection of activity here, and what you're looking at is a graph that shows the last 90 days of activity, and like I said, some of this activity sort of increasing more recently. Next item here is scan probes on port 23 TCP, that's Telnet, and we're looking at 60 days of data. We're going to look at it in terms of the number of source IP addresses later in the report here, but merely wanted to point out that there have been basically a resurgence or a boost in the number of probes on port 23 that basically has raised our level of alertness on that as well. As we've said many times, this is usually brute force password guessing, looking for devices that they can compromise. Usually, small devices that are Internet of Insecure Thing type devices that expose that port. In terms of the top 10 most probed ports, port 22 at the top of the list. I did take a look at the trend associated with that. There isn't really any significant trend taking place. It's only changed one place since last week. Next item, I think John reported on this last week, port 135 TCP. That's kind of been a come and go again port scanning activity consistently from the same provider. It looks like a US-based cloud provider with addresses registered to China. So it's a little bit of a strange situation there. Nevertheless, continuing the scan on that port, followed by
a bad reputation. That.
And yes, there is some other reputation information if you were to search that provider. Next item, port 23 TCP. We just talked about that. Port 445 TCP. That configure is still around. 53 UDP scanning for DNS servers. 443 TCP. Then followed by 1433 Microsoft SQL Database, 3389 Remote Desktop Protocol, 1900 UDP, that's SSDP used in reflection attacks, as is DNS often is as well. Well, just taking a little closer look at the probes on port 135 TCP. This is the DC endpoint resolution showing 30 days of activity. As you can see here, a big boost in the activity. As I said earlier, same Chinese registered addresses from a US provider, and it relatively consistently shows source port 4445. I'm not sure why that particular port is selected, but
last week too.
Yeah, you did.
I theorized it could be that they might be using ZMAP or what's that other one? Name's escaping me now, but one of those mass scan.
Yeah. There are certainly scanning tools that it's easier to just throw them out there and then see who responds rather than to actually set up a real session.
Right.
So it's a matter of efficiency. In terms of the most sources doing the probing, at the top of the list here, port 23. That's been fairly consistent, and we'll take a little closer look at that in a moment, followed by port 445. And then we have some peer-to-peer activity that's showing up there. And then we continue to see 17.788. That is continuing to go up. And as we had talked about in other weeks, it appears to be BitTorrent activity. And there is I'll say, a loose connection with the potential that it's, sort of pirated video content being basically made available to Chinese. So in terms of the scan sources on port 23 TCP, as you can see here, I put sort of a reference line on there just to give you an idea. We're looking at 90 days of activity, and you can see that the number of sources has kicked up significantly. This is typically, a botnet. What is a little different here is we typically see, like if you look back here near the end of March, we usually see this sort of bump up and then sort of this tail off. That is a command given to a botnet, and then it tails off. But more recently, we're seeing these slower sort of climbs, and I don't have a clear explanation for that. Perhaps a botnet's been segmented, or perhaps there's some sort of a propagation that takes place. It's not clear. You might also see that if it's the command and control is P2P, because it might take some time for the commands to propagate around. I'm only speculating on those points, but it is a little bit different than we had seen in the past.